Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our DS lecture for the week. We're very happy, in conjunction with the new welfare cluster within DS, to welcome Professor Marius Busemeyer. Marius is an old friend of the Danish Center for Welfare Studies, currently, and since a very, almost obscenely young age, full professor at University of Konstanz of Comparative Political Economy. He also is there the current speaker and the co-founder of their well-funded research excellence cluster on the politics of inequality. And Marius has, over the last decade or two, done very much to advance our understanding of a wide range of public policy and politics topics, mainly to do with education systems, vocational education systems, the preferences for education systems, the social investment paradigm, and very often with his own survey data, which was an added source of, I think, innovation. Today, Marius will talk about the next big thing, digitalization. We're very happy to have you, Marius. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pieter, for the introduction and for the invitation. I hope the microphone works. I'm very glad to be back here in Odense. I was also here some years ago for, I think, a conference or workshop, so I know the place well, and I'm really happy to be back here to talk a bit about my research. So the overall topic that the talk is going to be about is the consequences of digitalization for the welfare state, a little bit also about education, but I look at that more from the perspective of public opinion, citizens' preferences, individual attitudes. That has become one, if not the major research area in my work in the last years. And as Pieter said, I'm also going to show you some, I don't know why that, okay, it's not moving forward, I don't know why. Maybe I have to plug and unplug again, sorry for that. I hope it doesn't create too much of a mess. Oh, sorry. It does create a mess. Sorry for that. It's touch the screen with your mouse. Speaking of this. There you go. Okay, I usually have the same screen on my laptop, but not this time. Anyway, so that's also a little bit a shameless attempt of propagating my own work here. This is a book that I edited a few years ago, actually last year, on digitalization and the welfare state broadly defined. So this edited volume brings together a lot of scholars in this field, and we're trying to define a research area on this topic of how digitalization broadly defined might influence the welfare state in the coming years. It's a bit of a forward-looking exercise in the sense that many of the technical revolutions and also the effects of these technical changes on the labor market are not yet felt, but you can sort of see them on the horizon. I'm going to have a few examples later on. So much of the discussion about what that means for the welfare state is still in some ways hypothetical and theoretical, but we believe, I believe, and we believe in that book that it's still absolutely necessary and important to think about these things, because a lot of technological changes happen so fast nowadays that you kind of have to be prepared, so to speak. But on the other hand, you could say there has been a long history of thinking about the relationship between technological change and how it shapes the welfare state. Actually, you could say it's been there since the beginning of the welfare state, right? The Industrial Revolution back in the late 19th century set in motion the wheels for the emergence of the modern welfare state. And then you can sort of link different phases of welfare state development with different phases of economic development, technological change, the rise of Fordism in the 50s and 60s, the rise of the service economy, and consequently the rise of the social investment paradigm in the welfare state. So in many ways, this is maybe nothing new, and this is why a lot of people are sort of posing the question, will this time actually be different? What is so special about the current wave of digitalization that might lead us to rethink the relationship between technological change and the welfare state? And I think there are, and also we think in that edited volume, together with the other editors, although there are different positions on this issue in the book, that in the end, the answer is a qualified yes. So there are some aspects of the current wave of technological change that are indeed different, but we have to really think about what that means. And also, as a political scientist, I would say, in the end, it's still all about politics. So how technological change exactly affects inequality and the welfare state very much depends on the balance of power between different political actors and how these political struggles are played out. So to start the discussion and to motivate a little bit the talk, I want to start with some examples. So this is actually a pretty old one by now, and I keep updating these slides with examples because our technological changes are happening so quickly. But I still keep that one on the self-driving cars because actually it's a nice example as there's a paper, a very similar paper in this whole discussion about technological change and labor markets, co-authored by David Autor, the leading economist in that area, together with Acemoglu back in 2003, where they cited driving a car as an example of a task that would not be routinizable in the near future. So their paper was exactly about which jobs could be routinized, which jobs could be replaced by machines, and they cite this example of driving a car as a thing that could not be automated in the near future. And then just 6 years later, you start having the first self-driving cars, and then now, as you know, they keep being expanded. You have self-driving taxis in some cities. And at first, they looked a little bit like this Waymo car back on the left-hand side, but now they look nice. And so me coming from the state of Baden-Württemberg, being a civil servant of that wonderful state, I have to include a picture of a Mercedes-Benz here as well. So anyway, so self-driving cars are now nothing fancy anymore in a way, even though the leading economist just 20 years ago predicted they would never be routinizable, this activity of driving a car. Second example, this is something I really added new. As you know, everybody talks about ChatGPT and what it means for all sorts of things and the cousins of ChatGPT. So the especially advancement of AI has been extremely fast in the last year, you could even say, and it's quite difficult to predict how that will actually play out. There are first papers coming out looking at potential replacement effects of AI on jobs, and also some papers on replacement effects of robots and so on. But I think that the example of AI already shows the difference between this wave of current technological change and previous waves, because this time it's really much more directed at middle class and maybe even upper middle class jobs. If you think about the example of AI being used in medicine to look at pictures for diagnoses and image evaluation, there's AI being used in legal consulting services, management consulting even. So this, again, these are all tasks where people just a few years ago would say these are can never be automated, these kinds of things, because they are so, they require complex skills and so on and so forth. But a lot of this stuff is now actually being automated by AI. Even science and research. There's a special section in the last or previous to last edition of The Economist, how AI can revolutionize science, and you know, there's an example of a sort of self-automated research lab where you have a robot doing all sorts of experiments and AI evaluating these experiments, designing new experiments, and so on and so forth. So even us researchers are somehow challenged in that respect. Journalists, editors, and writers, and I think that's a nice example that I wanted to bring here. If you look at this picture below here, with a cooking magazine. So this was a real example of a cooking magazine, 99 recipes for pasta. It was completely written, including the pictures, designed by AI. And it came out as a regular cooking magazine in Germany in May this year, I think. And then the publisher didn't tell anyone about that it's actually all created by AIs. I mean, they had some human involvement in editing the text and also the pictures, but essentially it was still written and done by an AI. So that's already showing how things are going, and they have a new journalist at a sort of big newspaper in Cologne, and she's called something like Carla Ingut. So you realize the abbreviation KI, Künstliche Intelligenz in German. So this is actually also an AI writing text for a regular journal. So it's happening. And then we have now the first, I would say, maybe I'm overemphasizing this a little bit, but not so much. We have the first actual strike against the use of AI, and it's not done by the factory workers, but it's done by actors and screenplay writers in Hollywood, right? I mean, they're afraid that actors might be replaced by AI technology. And if you've seen the latest Indiana Jones movie, you could maybe say it doesn't work perfectly, even with Harrison Ford, but it's going in this direction. And so these are just some examples to highlight the extremely fast pace of developments and how that might affect labor markets and so on. So now moving more to actual research, as I hinted at, this is of course an extremely active and evolving research area, especially on research on labor market or effects on labor market. So in a way you could say as an important first step in the argument how digitalization might affect the welfare state, you first have to think about how it affects the labor market, because if it doesn't have any, or if it didn't have any effects on the labor market, the likelihood that it somehow affects the welfare state is rather low. Of course, there are other ways of how you can think that AI affects the welfare state. I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on, but this is the way I think about it. So how it affects the labor market and then how it affects the welfare state. And here there are some, as usual, different perspectives in the literature. So the pessimistic perspectives that talk about mass unemployment, rising inequality, and there is a lot of evidence by now that technological change has already increased job market polarization between the high-skilled and the low-skilled, or to be more precise, between those who have routinizable jobs on the one hand and those who have non-routinizable jobs on the other hand. And therefore also some effect on inequality. There are also other studies now coming out that looks at potential, it looks at this more from a general perspective. So if you have replacement effects of jobs in the one hand, does technological change maybe lead to the creation of new employment opportunities in other parts of the labor market? There is, for instance, and it might actually differ between countries. So there's one paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo on the US that shows that the spread of robots has replacement effects in the case of the United States. So jobs are lost because robots are introduced. Then there's a similar paper looking at this in the German case, and there you find the opposite. So the authors, one of them is a colleague of mine in Konstanz, they could show that there was much more new employment created in the service economy to overcompensate the loss of jobs due to robotization in other parts of the economy. And even if you introduce a lot of robots in specific companies, that might also help these companies to stay competitive and therefore save jobs in the long term. So as usual, the story is a little bit more complicated. And then finally, of course, there are, as usual, the skeptics who say, this is not so different from past waves of technological change. And to some extent, you could say they are right. We don't have mass unemployment yet, nowhere in the OECD world. Rather the opposite. We have scarcity of labor. So far there is not there are not huge replacement effects yet. But still, given these developments, there could be in the next few years. So if you extrapolate self-driving cars, automated supermarket cashiers, and so on, there might be entire job categories disappearing if the technology allows for it. But in the end, so it's all about how political factors, I would say, shape all these developments. And this is why, as a political scientist, I'm, of course, turning more towards politics. Just to give you a little bit of data on the extent of this. So this is actually a little bit outdated by now, but still quite relevant. This is a study that tried to estimate the automation potential of jobs across different OECD countries. And the gray bars indicate the share of employment that would be, according to this study, fully automatable. And you can see that's actually not so bad. It varies between sort of 6% or 7-8% and 10-12%. But the blue bars, they are big, and they make up most of the figure here. And the blue bars indicate not full replacement of jobs, but significant changes in job categories. And I think that's also the most likely development, that you will maybe not see full replacement of jobs, or full elimination of jobs, but you will see significant transformations of existing occupations, labor market patterns, need of upskilling, shifts within occupations towards more highly skilled tasks within occupations, this kind of thing. And then this is the figure. This is the figure about labor market polarization. This is looking back, so this is not even trying to predict what's happening in the future, but this is just looking back. And there you see the evidence for the so-called hollowing out of the middle hypothesis. That means that it's not a purely simple linear inequality effect that we are observing, that the low-skilled are being shoved out and the high-skilled benefit, but it's rather a more complicated story where most pressure is put on the middle-class jobs. The jobs that are typical middle-class jobs but easy to routinize, clerical work, simple managerial administrative tasks, this kind of things. And these, so we do see employment growth for the high-skilled jobs with abstract tasks, and we also see employment growth for the jobs with simple manual tasks, waiting in hotels, hairdressing, this kind of relatively person-intensive service sector jobs. And so in a way, it's really the middle-class jobs that are now most pressured by technological change, and this is what the figure shows. Okay, sorry, I have to look up always because it's not on my screen here, but anyway. So what does it actually mean for the welfare state? That's now my main question, actually. The way I think about it, as I said before, it runs basically through the labor market. It changes also different power constellations within the labor market. Trade unions are sort of more under pressure because of these changing technological contexts, but also we have new actors that are emerging, especially the global tech companies with platform power. That's, I think, a very important aspect of the whole story, but not a story that I look at yet intensely, but it's of course very important. And I mean, that's, I think, something that I'm mostly focusing on here in this talk, whether there are new cleavages, political cleavages emerging between winners and losers of digitalization. So whether and to what extent digitalization creates a different kind of politics of the welfare state, and whether that correlates with existing cleavages or whether you can actually see new cleavages emerging. And then the question, when you move more from the politics side to the policy side, what kind of policy reforms do people actually want when they think about digitalization and the welfare state, right? Do they demand more of the same? Do they want similar kinds of policies that we have had in the past, or do they want new policies, more radical solutions to technological change? For instance, the issue of universal basic income is often discussed in that context as a radical policy response to technological change. But one could think of other things like creating public employment to compensate for loss of employment in the private sector, many other things. And that's an empirical question because we don't really know exactly yet what the individual voters want, but also what the collective actors that are in charge of this actually would like to see. So this is now moving more to the empirical side of things, and this issue of how citizens and voters react to digitalization, how they perceive digitalization as a potential source of risk, and how that's related to their social policy demands. That's the core question of my empirical part here. And I want to present a few findings from a related set of papers. Some of them are already published, some of them are still in the works. And so the first part is is from from two published papers together with Tobias Tober, Carlo Knotz, Mia Gantenberger. We use data from a survey that was done by the OECD actually in the year 2020. It's the so-called Risks That Matter survey. It's a survey actually about social risks, broadly defined, and we had the opportunity to design or to get a block of questions in there about the consequences of digitalization and technological change. And the nice thing about it is that the OECD took care of all the administrative stuff, and we just got the data in the end. And we now have data for more than 20 OECD countries, 25 to be exact, and 25,000 respondents. So it's really possible to also do some cross-national comparisons here. And by now, actually, I think the data is in the public domain. So if you're interested in that data, it's available somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but it's available. This is just the first impression about the perception of social risks associated with technological change. Here we ask people, how much are you worried that your job might be replaced by AI, software, robots? So we adopt a broad definition of technological change in the next 5 years. And here you can see that the shares of people being worried actually in some countries are very high. So maybe also mostly in the transition economies and those countries that have a more residual welfare state, Southern Europe, but also places like Turkey, Korea, where people are extremely worried about digitalization. And then other places with more generously funded welfare state, Austria, Finland, Norway, people are significantly less worried about this. So obviously the welfare state already plays a certain role here in shaping these risk perceptions of people. If you maybe remember a little bit what the figure from before where I showed you the real automation risk in these countries, you could see that this is not necessarily directly related. So for instance, the case of Korea, automation potential is actually quite low because they have already undergone a lot of rationalization and technological change in the last 10 to 15 years, which is why they are now really worried about that, because they experience this, but looking forward, the risk is actually lower than in other countries. For instance, in Germany, the objective risk is quite high, but subjectively people don't really see it yet. So you can see there's also some interesting associations and non-associations between objective risk and subjective perceptions of this, which we are also exploring actually in a different paper. And I should also say, we also ask people about their positive views on technological change, and people also have positive views on what technological change might do for them in the job. And they are more or less on the same level as these negative risk perceptions. So somehow in the minds of people, technological change has both positive and negative effects. But admittedly, I'm focusing more on the negative effects here for now. So this is just descriptively what kind of policies people would support in response to these technological changes. And this is going to come back in different flavors in the next slides. The big distinction here that we draw is between policies that are focusing on social investment, so investing in education, training, research, sometimes even also the physical infrastructure, so public investment in the traditional sense on the one hand, and more compensatory or protective policies on the other. So compensatory policies would be increasing the level of unemployment benefits, but also things like introducing a universal basic income. There are some policies that sort of fall in between, introducing a limit on working hours, for instance. That's something that's at least discussed a lot in Germany. We have this introducing a tax on robots that doesn't quite fit in here. Sometimes it's related to the specific ways that these questions were designed. We do it, have later on survey data where we designed our own survey where we have a little bit more of a consistent classification in terms of policies. What we do not actually also look at here is whether people would support slowing down the pace of technological change. Other people have done that as well in other surveys. But for us, that's a different question. So it's not really about regulatory aspects so much, but more about this dichotomy between social investment and compensatory policies. And then, largely speaking, you could see that social investment policies are supported the most. So this is option A and B, investing more in university education and retraining opportunities, supported by 75% or up to 80% of all people across all these 25 OECD countries. Least supported is this introduction of a robo-tax, which is a bit surprising, but I think it's just because people don't like tax increases. On a medium level of support, we see this compensatory policies, which is actually maybe also to some extent surprising, because you would say that people are actually very fond of having a more generous welfare state, but they even like social investment policies way more. And that's something that I also know from my previous research on education. But now we're trying to make that simpler. So we create two factors in that paper. One is the social investment factor. The other is the compensatory factor. And they load quite nicely on these two factors, as you can see in the upper part of the slide. And so in this regression analysis here, this is the dependent variable. On the one hand, support for social investment policies, summing up these different policy items that I mentioned before. And on the other hand, support for the compensatory protective policies. And what is the question here? The question is, to what extent do these subjective risk perceptions actually affect your individual level preferences? So to what extent do people who feel threatened by digitalization have specific demands on the welfare state, and how might this be affected by other individual level factors such as educational background, age, gender, but also, this is an interesting variable as well, the variable of tech users. These are people who work with complex technology on their job regularly, so whether you use a lot of technology on your job or not. And the basic insight of that figure here is, if you look at the upper half of the left-hand figure, is that people who perceive themselves to be at high risk due to automation and digitalization would rather like to see more compensatory policies. You can see the dot is very much to the right, indicating a statistically significant positive effect on support for compensatory policies. And less supportive of social investment policies, right? This is a statistically significant effect in the other direction. So in a way, why is that interesting? It's because a lot of people, when they talk about technological change, usually recommend we just have to invest more in education and training and everything will be fine. And this research actually shows that people who feel themselves to be threatened by technological change do not really subscribe to that idea. They would rather like to see more compensation through more generous unemployment benefits and policies like that, and not so much investing in education and training. Even though potentially from an objective perspective that would be better for them. But this is already indicating political conflict potential, because people directly affected by this have different demands on the welfare state than what experts and many policymakers recommend in response to technological change. And then the other variables, you can see some potential for a digital divide emerging, so to speak, or new cleavage potentially opening up, namely between high-income people and those with tertiary education. They also very much support higher investment in social investment. That's also something we know from before. Less investment on compensation. So again, in other words, what does that mean politically? The people who usually have to pay for this via their taxes, they would rather like to see more investments in education and training in response to digitalization, not so much investments in compensatory policies. But the people affected by technological change would like to see the opposite. So this is indicating some conflict potential and new cleavage is opening up. What we did on the right-hand side is adding some macro-level variables on the context of the different countries. You see some effects, but nothing spectacular, with the exception of unemployment. So when unemployment levels are high in specific countries, you see just more demand for both compensatory and social investment policies, which is sort of as expected. What is maybe also interesting is interaction effects. So how do these different variables interact with each other? And here I have this example of interaction effects between high subjective risks and being a user of technology at the workplace. So you could say that the group of technology users at the workplace is also quite heterogeneous. So you might think of a high-level software engineer uses technology all the time. You could think of a supermarket cashier. Okay, that's not so complex, sorry, but you could also think of a more low-level job that also uses a lot of technology on the workplace. And this one person might be very confident that she's not going to be replaced by technology in the near future, and this other person might be very worried because this person works with technology all the time. So you can see that there is some potential for heterogeneity, and that's exactly what we find. We find some technology users that are very worried about being replaced by a machine, and others that are not worried at all. And if you then interact these two aspects, you can see the following. or I summarize it in simple words. Basically, risk perceptions trump technology use. So technology users who feel themselves to be at high risk are also more supportive of compensatory policies, even though heavy technology users in general actually would like to see more social investment. So that simply indicates, again, a little bit of a potential for new cleavages emerging related to these risk perceptions. Okay, then how am I doing on time? I can be maybe a little bit briefer here in this respect, because this is basically just a follow-up study of the previous one, because you could say, this is a well-known problem in survey research that people might just say yes to everything and respond, yes, we want more of spending to everything. So what we did in this setup, we just forced people to prioritize between different areas of the welfare state. We gave them a fixed budget of 100 units, currency units, whatever that might be. And then we forced them to allocate these currency unions to these different 5 different policy options, again, basically differentiating between social investment and compensatory policies. And you can see that the same effects occur. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically you see the same dynamic emerging, that people who are perceive themselves to be at high risk, they want more compensatory policies or allocate more budget to the compensatory policies versus social investment. So this is basically just confirming what we found in the other study as well. So then moving on to yet another survey. So this is new stuff that hasn't been published yet. We're just working on the papers. This is data from a survey that we ran ourselves with support from the Excellence Cluster that Pieter mentioned. And we couldn't do it in 25 OECD countries. That would have been a little bit too expensive. So we did it in 6 countries, namely Germany, Japan, Sweden, Spain, Poland, and the US, to get a sort of broad overview of different welfare state regimes, different types of political economy. And in each country, we had about 3,300 people. It was done by a professional survey company, via online access panels, for those of you interested in the details. So it's basically representative samples of these different countries. And in this part of the project, we are broadening up the research question a little bit, because digitalization is maybe a very important factor in influencing labor markets, but there is also something else, namely the green transition, that is keeping people worried to some extent. So what are potential effects on labor markets related to the transformation of the economy towards a carbon neutral economy? At least that's in some countries in the sample a hotly debated topic. And so we wanted to see whether the policy responses or the policy demands that people have on the welfare state, whether they differ systematically when whether they think about the green transition or digitalization. So does it matter which kind of labor market transformation you think about? And this is actually very little literature to go on that would directly compare these different challenges. And so ex ante, you could think of different equally plausible answers to this question. On the one hand, you could say, well, there are certainly differences between these two things, right? Politically speaking, the green transition is much more debated. It's a very visible topic that could also lead to more support for the green transition overall, but maybe also more contestation, more political polarization. And of course, the actual effects on the labor market should also be quite different. Digitalization affects a lot of economic sectors and more happening on the occupational level versus the green transition, where it's more about shifts between economic sectors, moving from fossil-based fuel towards green and renewable energy, getting rid of combustion engine and introducing electrical vehicles and so on. So it's different kinds of effects on the labor market. And therefore you could say, well, people should be differently affected by this and therefore might demand different things from the welfare state. But on the other hand, that would be the counter hypothesis. You know, people might just not have these differentiated perspectives on different labor market challenges. They somehow just perceive one overall labor market risk, and they cannot really differentiate between different sources, And they might also not have very differentiated policy expectations regarding these different things. And of course, we're also again looking at cross-country differences here to some extent. And so this, to give you some impression on the data, this is a first indication that people do differentiate to some extent between these two things, and also that there is variation across countries. So the upper part of the upper figure indicates, similar to what we've done before, individual risk perceptions related to the green transition or digitalization. So to what extent people themselves feel threatened in their jobs by these different labor market challenges. And you can see that basically people are more worried about the green transition than digitalization. That already shows that this is a salient topic potentially, right? It's not something that doesn't keep people busy, but it's really actually a quite important thing, especially in a country like the US. But then in the lower, and you do see a lot of variation across country between Sweden, Japan on the one hand, not so many people being worried, and the US with high levels of risk perceptions. In the lower figure, we actually look at not only at the individual risk perceptions, but how much people are worried that this might affect their country as a whole negatively. And here people are even more worried about this. And in that case, actually, people are more worried about digitalization in most countries. So this is something we're still working on and are pursuing further. But for now, I'm focusing more on the individual risk perceptions to some extent. And as before, so I'm going to be brief on this one here, we have a range of potential policy options that people can reply to in response to either digitalization or the green transition. And I should say here, we're using a very simple experimental survey design where we just split the sample in half. So people only get this question once, and they ask either for digitalization or for the green transition. So they don't respond to the same question twice, but they only get this question once, and then some people are in the digitalization group, other people are in the green transition group, and then therefore you can directly compare the response patterns without spillover effects between the two. It's a very simple survey experiment, so to speak. We have more complicated stuff coming on later on. But anyway, these two factors that you know from the previous slides are again surfacing here. Items that are measuring support for compensation. We add here also subsidies to firms that might be particularly affected by these labor market transformations. And social investment, you already know that from before. And this is how it looks again descriptively. So this is the simple answer. If you just look at the average levels of support for all these policies, so this is basically the average level of support that the state should do something about either digitalization or the green transition across these different countries. And you see that on the one hand, average levels of support are very high. So people, 60% and more say, yes, the state should do something about this. That's maybe not so surprising given that we know that people really like the welfare state. But if you then compare digitalization and the green transition, there's no difference. So basically, even though these things affect the welfare state or the labor market, I should say, quite differently, people don't really have different kinds of policy responses in mind when they think about how the state should respond to this. And you also see a little bit of an effect of the welfare state context that in Spain, for instance, where the welfare state is still a little bit less developed than in Sweden, for instance, there is more support for governmental action than say in Sweden. So you do see that. And then if you're moving on to this differentiation between the green transition, with social investment and compensatory policies, again, you don't see any differences between the two sides. So different challenges, same policy responses, you could say. And as before, we see more support for social investment policies overall compared to the compensatory policies. And then moving on to the regression analysis of individual level factors, again, you can focus on the upper part, and to some extent, and it's very encouraging because a completely different data set, completely different data collection, we do see the similar effects as we had before. So people who perceive themselves to be at high risk either of being exposed to digitalization or the green transition have a greater demand for compensatory policies rather than social investment policies, except for those who are extremely perceive themselves to be extremely high risk. They also like to see a little bit more social investment. So, but that's very consistent with what we found before. Maybe a little more puzzling and something that we're still working on is this effect of the market risk. This is the way it's depicted here in the figure, but you could also say sociotropic risk. So when people think that the country as a whole is negatively affected by that, they actually support policy action less. So you would say the opposite, right? You would say if people are worried that this might affect the country negatively, they should demand more government action, but you see the opposite effect here, that people actually want less government action. That's an effect that we know from research on the impact of business cycles or macroeconomic conditions on support for governmental action in other parts of the literature, that people, when they perceive themselves to be in an economic bad place, so to speak, they become more conservative. They want less public spending because they are too worried about that. But that's something that we still need to figure out, also how these individual risk perceptions are related to the sociotropic risk perceptions. So in a way, this is confirming what we found before, and that's encouraging, but we do see the main finding here is that we don't really see strong differences between the different transitions. We do see some country level effects, so that as before in countries like Spain, general support for both types of policies is higher. In Japan, people are less supportive of compensatory policies and so on, but the country differences are not that large. All right, so to conclude, I'm sort of running out of time, so let me just conclude briefly with a few words. I think what I wanted to get across is that digitalization does pose a huge challenge for labor markets and therefore also for the welfare state, but maybe not so much with regard to leading to mass unemployment, but rather with regard to how labor market structures are transformed and how existing occupational structures have to be adopted to these new context conditions. And I think, as I said before, the answer to the question, is this time different? It would be a qualified yes. We do see extremely fast pace of development in the technology area. And so far, it's really quite unpredictable what exactly will happen with AI advancing in this fast pace. We also see the green transition taking up speed, even though it always goes back and forth to some extent. But these dual transformations of labor markets are certainly challenging the politics of the welfare state to some extent in the coming 10, 15 years especially. So this is, I think, also a unique moment where you have these two big transformations happening at the same time. We do see a lot of support for social investment, but as I said before, this is not necessarily shared by those people who feel themselves to be most affected by these labor market transformation that hints at potentially difficult political decisions that have to be made. And so the policy implications for this is investing in education. Does it make sense or not? I would say yes, but there's important conditions attached to this because it's not a panacea. It's not something that can cure all of the problems that might result from these transformations, because not everybody can become an IT expert, obviously, so you need to have also policy solutions for those that are really left behind in this transformation towards a carbon neutral knowledge economy, so to speak. One thing that might play an increasingly important role, I didn't talk a lot about this here in the talk, but I think it's becoming more important, and I'm doing some other work on this as well, is the local and the regional level, and how potentially also the knowledge economy plays out at the local level, how different clusters of knowledge economies emerge and potentially open up new conflicts between urban areas and rural areas. So I think more attention also in the welfare state scholarship should be paid to these local effects of these big transformations. All right, that's it from my side. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Marius. floor is open. I suggest you take them as you see fit,
Yeah.
Marius. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, we can start here.
Yeah, thank you so much for your interesting talk. I'm not a social scientist, but I have a question nevertheless. You described how sort of digital technology makes a difference in respect to labor and the welfare state. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about whether there's something also different and new in the technology as such that causes this change. Because in certain ways you make also a deterministic causal argument. There's the technology and that changes society. But it could also be that there are already these processes going on in society and the technology is just a carrier of these processes. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more general about this. And then also in the beginning of your talk, you talked about AI and the self-driving cars, almost as if they would already kind of work pretty well. But isn't it also an imaginary that we think they're working well? I mean, there are those cars in San Francisco, and of course they are there, but I mean, there are also so many flaws still, right?
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. I mean, I don't want to be deterministic at all. I just simplified a lot for the purposes of the talk. So of course, and I think actually what I said, I mean, this is the whole, one of the core arguments of, I would say, comparative political economy and welfare state research, that it's not automatic process technology leading to some kind of societal reaction. That's functionalism, essentially, right? So we are emphasizing political contingency to, in many ways, this can and will be decided by political factors in the end, how exactly that will play out. But you're also right in emphasizing the reverse causality. So technological change is, of course, also endogenous, as the economists would say to some extent. So policy decisions shape the pace, the nature of technological change. And there's also a little bit of research actually on how welfare states can create innovation, so technological change or not, right? And so people also look at the reverse side, but if you try to do everything at the same time, it just becomes extremely complex. So I'm focusing just on this one small part that leads from tech change to the labor market to the welfare state. But of course, you have to keep in mind that this is a whole emergent thing. And about the examples, you're right. Of course, a lot of this, there are still technological hiccups. You know, AI doesn't work perfect, self-driving cars don't work perfect, and so on. But I would say if you have this forward-looking perspective, you can sort of extrapolate that maybe in 5 or 10 years, these technological issues will be solved, right? And then it's a question of politics again, and regulatory politics. How do we solve also essentially with the self-driving cars, the moral implications? Where should the algorithm go if there's a kid in front and an old woman on the side? So where, this kind of things, right? But these are political decisions, and so I think that's again coming up to this idea that there is a lot of political contingency involved to some extent. But I would say that this example is mainly to show that even experts are sort of at a loss at some point. David Otto just wrote a paper last year, interesting paper with the title from, what was it, from cautious optimism to skepticism to unpredictability or something like that. So this is also describing his own way of thinking over 20 years about that issue, that in the beginning he was pretty optimistic that it's not going to be so bad, and now he's actually getting more worried as one of the leading figures in that area. So I think that describes it quite well. Yeah.
So thank you, Marius, for a really interesting talk. So you focus very much on this kind of technological change, changing labor markets, changing welfare state links. But you also, especially in the beginning, hint about this as the digital cleavage.
Yeah.
And I think that I mean, also points to the politics side more than the policy side, which you tend to focus on in your presentation here. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit. So you have the argument that now it's the middle classes, the higher middle classes that are kind of under threat or under pressure, as we know from C. Wright Mills writing 70 years ago. I mean, this is also the most status anxious social groups, so they will react when they fear that they will that their status is under threat. But could you maybe then kind of elaborate how will this kind of play into role in, say, the political landscape, political reactions, which is like a key argument of the cleavage literature, that these kind of changes are so deep that they create some kind of significant changes? Will it be just like a flavor to the things we know, so growing polarization, populism, urban, rural, and the spatial inequality divides and so on? Or will it be something really new where this kind of, say, relatively powerful middle class group will have draconic political reactions? I mean, how do you see this kind of play into, say, the politics side?
Yeah, thank you very much. You're right that I didn't talk so much in the end about these political cleavages, even though I promised to do. Well, I would say, on the one hand, at the moment, I don't see yet the potential of this becoming a completely new cleavage in the Rocanian sense, because you don't have a pro-digitalization and anti-digitalization parties coming up, right? So in many ways, it maps onto existing cleavage structures. That's one side of it. But on the other hand, I would say you already see some effects on how technological change affects existing cleavages and shapes them in new ways. So one example of this would be the difference between education and income. So traditionally, a core cleavage in welfare state politics, or politics more generally, is the income cleavage, high versus low income. And this is becoming less and less important, but it's more about education, right? So it's more the highly educated versus the low educated that is emerging as the important cleavage now. And I think technological change plays to some extent a role in that. It's not only about technology, but it plays a role in this. And the second example would be this emerging rift between what people like Daniel Oesch and Silja Heusermann call the old and the new middle classes, right? So there's a rift within the middle class now, with some people being on the winning side of technological change, on socioeconomic transformations, moving up, social cultural professionals like ourselves, so to speak. Other people, the old middle classes, are moving down or face downward movement. And there's research by Thomas Kura, Brian Begoun, many others that show that this looking downward basically creates a lot of, or is one of the factors that create support for right-wing populist parties. So it's already happening to some extent, right? And I think especially this emerging cleavage within the middle class, between the old and the new middle classes, that is directly related to technological change. And so it's already happening. And there are some work now coming up looking at how technological change itself influences support for right-wing populism, and there are some indications that it does. So I think there is something there. At the same time, I would say that's more about political salience, and this comparison also with the green transition. People are not really aware of that. So in a direct way. So many people. Because digitalization sort of happens everywhere in a rather diffuse process, not so visible like the green transition. People are not that aware of it, but it still has these effects. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for an interesting talk. I was intrigued by the non-difference between the green transition and digitalization. That was quite interesting. But my question was also in the direction of what Klaus said, because when I compare this to what happened before, and not previous waves of technological change, but globalization in the 80s to 2000s or so, I think, I mean, I had also some involvement in that research, and self-critically, the perspective was probably way too narrow, because we didn't really perceive the prospect of globalization itself becoming so politicized and a massive backlash against globalization. And I wonder whether this kind of research that you're presenting is also correct, but also way too narrow. Because, I mean, the only question that you had, which was kind of backlash oriented, was this taxing technology itself, which, you know, might be one instrument, but it could also be like a bigger backlash against the educated classes or something that we totally miss. And I wonder whether you have any kind of hunches about this, whether it's like the politics will really be about investment versus compensation, which I doubt. I mean, this is this very technocratic way of looking at the problem, which in globalization nobody really cared about. It was like us against them in the end. So yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts on.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and as a fair point of criticism. Well, I mean, let me start by saying this. I mean, we thought about whether we should add this dimension of slowing down or increasing the pace of technological change. In the end, we decided against it because it would open up a different dimension, so it would make things more complicated. But maybe we should have done it. But anyway, so there are other surveys. Actually, other people have done surveys on this issue. I think it was Nicole Wu in the US. At least there are a couple of papers out that have that issue. And there's an interesting difference to globalization. If you ask directly about support for slowing down or increasing the pace of technological change, there's no backlash. So everybody wants the government to keep investing in technology and to not slow down the pace of technological change. That's potentially a difference to globalization, where we see more of a direct demand for lowering globalization exposure and so on, right? So that's certainly something worth exploring further. I should also could also mention that I'm involved in another sort of project group or a paper project where we compare something similar, like an experimental design where we compare the effects of digitalization, but in this case not versus the green transition, but versus globalization. And in that case, but similar to this, there are no differences essentially. So basically, people do not seem to differentiate really between these challenges, whether that's to some extent also a problem of how to measure these things, these attitudes, or whether it's a real non-difference. It's open to debate, but I would say there are indications mounting that people sort of have a more general impression of how exposed they are on the labor market and not distinguish so much between these different sources. And then the last point maybe is that in the case of globalization, it's much easier to have this us versus them logic, as you say, because it can be attached to different groups of people, right? Insiders, outsiders, and in the case of technological change, for some reason it seems to be much easier to be angry about other people rather than about machines, right? So it seems that people are much less opposed to the slowing down the pace of tech change compared to globalization. That's an interesting finding that's definitely worth pursuing further.
Do we have other questions? If not, let me once again thank you for a very wide-ranging talk on a very timely topic. And maybe one more round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Great, that's it, I guess. Thank you.